right. Well, on that note, I will start by welcoming everyone to the Wednesday Compass seminar. My name is Aidan Mahoney. I am a second-year PhD student in the ATM department, and it is my honor to introduce Dr. Flavio Lehner. Flavio is an assistant professor in Cornell University's Department of Earth and Atmospheric Sciences. Flavio got his PhD in 2013 from the Institute for Climate and Environmental Research at the University of Bern in Switzerland. He then did 2 postdocs at the National Center for Atmospheric Research in Colorado, one in fundamental and one in more applied climate science. Building on this, he stayed at NCAR as a project scientist trying to bridge the gap between what we know and don't know about climate change and what we might do with all of this information. After a 1-year sabbatical at ETH Zurich back in Switzerland, he joined Cornell University in 2020. And for the fun facts, this will be Flavio's first time to Florida. I'm sorry. Perhaps as a consequence, he has never been in or near a hurricane, except there are a lot of hurricanes in the room today. Instead, Flavio as a student was on a research cruise into Fram Strait, where he fell in love with sea ice and polar bears, which might have contributed to him working with the nonprofit Polar Bears International on climate science-informed conservation. And finally, he is the faculty advisor to the Cornell pool team, Big Red Billiards. So without further ado, Flavio, take it away.
Thanks, Aidan. Thanks for having me. I like that. That you guys asked for fun facts. Angie had a whole list, so she has more history here too. I should say, Cornell is a fun place to no small part because there's great students like Aidan. That's where we met. And so it's a pleasure to be here. I'm going to try to give sort of a rather broad talk, I think. Like any individual topic that I'll sort of touch upon, I'm happy to talk about in more detail if anybody wants to meet one-on-one. But in that sense, it's a little bit broad, but hopefully still interesting. I did want to sort of, I can advance. That might be the one thing that doesn't work. There we go. To sort of maybe give you a sense, I've been there 2 years at Cornell University, and my group is growing, and the different things that people do kind of speaks to the broad interests that I have. So I have currently 2 relatively new postdocs working with me, Ankur and Hanjun, and then 2 grad students, Yaning and Richard Tui, and an undergrad, Hao Yu, that is finishing up this summer. And so we have like a broad spectrum of topics that people work on, like maybe the sort of one sort of weight is a bit on like looking at regional climate change projections and what uncertainties we encounter there, and I'll talk a little bit about that. But then we also have sort of relatively specific applications, like Hanjun is working on looking at runoff sensitivity in climate models. I'll try to talk a little bit about that. And then Hao Yu is working on freezing rain, trying to develop new algorithms to detect it in observations and model simulations. And I have this, instead of like an actual outline to my talk, I have this kind of schematic that I feel like in a way encompasses a lot of my research, where I look at global projections of climate change using climate models, and you'll see a fair bit of that in the first part of the talk. It's sort of stylized here with a figure from a workshop we had a couple years ago. But then ultimately I also spend a fair bit of time and individual projects on the question, okay, this whole range of possible futures that we can project and create with climate models, what does it actually mean for impact questions on the ground? And if we have enough time, we'll get to this specific example. These are 2 pictures from Lake Mead, in the southwestern United States, big reservoir, and the question what will happen to these kind of infrastructure projects and generally water resources in all these different possible climates that we might encounter this century and beyond. And so at the core of this question, what will happen to future climate change are of course emission scenarios, and I don't need to spend as much time here probably than in other instances where I talked about this, but long story short, there's a lot of possible futures that people have tried to create, even though there's a lot of them they're probably still somewhat undersampling all the things that could happen, or that at least we could imagine happening. And it's expressed here as net CO2 emissions globally over time, over the century. And I think then highlighted in some of the colors are a set of experiments that were, or a set of scenarios that were then used to actually run climate model with. One of the points here is that you see way more lines on there than we would actually explore with climate modeling, because we're computationally limited, but they kind of span the whole range from an emission scenario with aggressive expansion of emissions leading to a world of about 5 degrees warmer, all the way to aggressive mitigation scenarios with negative emissions already in the second half of this century. This is just breaking down, or like stripping away all these excess scenarios, and these are kind of the 5 scenarios with weird names that we don't necessarily need to remember for this talk, but these are the ones that we typically use in climate science in the latest generation of assessments, the CMIP6 and the IPCC6, to look at future projections. And so I note that there's one scenario that already has a net zero CO2 emission by shortly after 2050, which is quite a challenge, and maybe we have a little bit of time at the end to talk about how realistic that is. So I've already alluded to that. If you put these scenarios through the current generation of climate models, you end up with a broad range of global temperature projections. I mentioned the most aggressive mitigation manages to keep global temperatures at about 1.5 degrees over pre-industrial, sort of a pre-industrial reference period before we started to emit vast amounts of CO2, and then kind of the worst case or high emission scenario, SSP 585 up there, leading to about 5 degrees of global warming. Ultimately, we do all this research, especially using these kind of scenarios, to relate it to things on the ground, and I've just thrown in a couple of things what these different scenarios might mean. So the second to lowest one, if we understand the system well enough, should get us to about 2 degrees of warming. This is something that's been labeled as dangerous amount of climate change. You can of course discuss what that means, but that's a term that's been adapted sort of in the policy discussion around the 2 degree target. So people said well, we don't want to get there, so let's try to stay at 2 degrees if we can at all. And then a little after the 2 degree target, people introduced the 1.5 degree target, which you actually hear more about nowadays in the news than the 2 degree target. It's, as far as I understand, the history of this target existing in the policy world was actually mostly because the latest sea level rise research suggested that if we go beyond 1.5 degrees, likely some of the low-lying island nations might actually be underwater in the long term. So they made a strong case for adopting a 1.5 degree target, which was done in the Paris climate agreements, climate negotiations in, I think, 2015. Again, whether this is achievable or not is a bit of a different discussion, but these are sort of some of the impacts that can be associated with that. And then at the very high end of these emission scenarios, again, you could come up with many examples, but one that I find kind of striking is that if you think about a world today where you have a very strong heat extreme, a heat wave that would sort of only occur once in 50 years, in a world like that where global temperature is 5 degrees warmer, this would basically happen every year. So this drastic change in return periods of extreme events under those scenarios. And I don't want to go into detail too much, but this is a new figure that just came out in the synthesis report of the IPCC. So the IPCC has published all their reports, the latest set last year, I think, and then they write a synthesis report. And one of the sort of highlight figures from that new synthesis report is that these so-called burning amber figures, these colored figures over there that map onto certain temperature targets, it's a bit complicated, but what I want to highlight too is that the darker, the higher the risk to see certain impacts, negative largely from climate change. And so there's a comparison of the previous IPCC report and the newest one. And so in all of these sections, the latest science actually suggests that for a given temperature target, we are more likely to see these impacts than we did before. So in a way, the latest science suggests that there's slightly larger risks than we thought to see some of these negative impacts. But yeah, this just a highlight. I don't want to walk through all of these individual ones. Instead, I want to like expand the framing a little bit in the sense of, yes, there's like all these different scenarios. So these are all possible futures that we might experience. So the question becomes a little bit, where are we going? Where are we headed? And then for me, it's also interesting to think about who wants to know the answer to this question. And there's a long list that basically encompasses kind of everything you might think of, like individual countries, federal agencies within them, cities, municipalities, NGOs, and then also in investment firms. I recently gave a talk to basically a financial advisory company where they asked me to tell them whether we can select the best climate models globally and for all questions. And US climate scientists might know that that's not easily possible, but they wanted to know the latest science on that. So yeah, people in the private industry are definitely starting to look at these projections and want to try to make sense of it. I think you have Alicia Karspek here recently, and I'm sure she talked a lot about this because she's actually worked in some of these companies. So yeah, these kind of questions are pretty broadly asked nowadays. The question is a little bit, can we answer them from the science perspective? So what I want to do now is like walk you briefly through a sort of a first cut at carving up these different uncertainties that make up our future, this question of where are we going. I'm going to do this at an example just of global temperature to start out with. And so what you see here are is 3 time series from the same climate model, doesn't matter necessarily which one, for 3 different emission scenarios. You can kind of see one doesn't have a lot of warming, one is sort of middle of the road, and one is a high emission scenario. So what we need to do first is we need to estimate what we generally call like a forced response. So we see these time series are annual global temperatures. They have like ups and downs, internal variability. And so we want to know for each of these emission scenarios what's the forced response, so what is actually the effect of climate change. You can, in this case, you can eyeball it pretty well. Yeah, the forcing in the high emission scenario is going up, and the other one not so much. So when we estimate this forced response, in this case with a simple statistical fit to this time series, we can subtract it, and what we're left with is what we call internal variability. I'll talk a little bit more about this, I think, in the next slide. Yep. So internal variability, I'm never quite sure how familiar people are with this concept in the context of climate change, but it's basically your day-to-day, year-to-year, decade-to-decade variations in the weather that are intrinsic to the system. So you can think of it as like roll of the dice or the butterfly effect, as something that is in a way inherent to the system. However, it makes it sometimes complicated to understand what change is forced and what might be occurring naturally. But now, with this simple way here, we kind of separate these sources. We'll look at more complicated cases later. And here's just like another illustration that like really drew me to this paper from Claire Desser in 2012, illustrating this concept. So this is like 3 maps coming from a climate model that was run many, many times. And the only thing that was different about the many, many iterations were the initial conditions. So it's the same climate model, same emission scenario, same physics, everything. Only the initial conditions are slightly different, but really only slightly different. And despite these very small changes in the initial conditions, they can produce, even on time scale of 55 years, quite different, in this case, temperature projections or temperature trends. So if you go into this ensemble of simulations, I think it was order 40, and you look for the one that has the warmest trend over North America, that's what the pattern looks like. The coldest one looks like this. And then the average of all the simulations is like the forced response, right? We're getting rid of all the noise. That's shown on top here, and that's kind of easy physically to understand. We have Arctic amplification, etc. But these are equally likely actual realizations that we could experience that are completely consistent with the forced response that's shown up there. So you see that even for something like temperature, there can be sizable differences depending on the region, just emerging from internal variability. So it is kind of an important thing to keep track of in this partitioning of the uncertainty sources. Now I've shown you this for an example of one individual model. Now we go into this whole CMIP archive and do this for all the different models, and you see this down here. So now we can sort of like start to quantify this. Now we have, for the same emission scenario, this red one, this high emission scenario, we have a whole range of models that try to do the same thing, and you see they don't necessarily agree. There's a spread there. That's what we call model or response uncertainty. So given a certain forcing, the models do not necessarily agree on how much warming this should result in. Then we also have slightly different estimates from the different models for how large the internal variability component is. And then finally, that's like a bit easier. In this case, we're looking at 3 different scenarios, and that kind of samples our scenario uncertainty space. Now with the latest, this is actually from the previous sort of set of model simulations. The latest one that I showed you before, we're looking at 4 or 5 scenarios. But generally just the spread across scenarios is our scenario uncertainty. Now we can actually calculate each of these, like we can calculate the variance across models, the variance in time for internal variability, and across scenario uncertainty. And that's kind of what this would look like for the same time period, variance in temperature for these different sources of uncertainty. So we can add them up to like a total uncertainty, which corresponds just to this whole spread, this like unknown future that we talked about. Because of that, we can then also express it in a relative sense, and that eventually leads us to some of these iconic figures that were originally developed by Ed Hawkins in 2009. So what you see here is, again, as a function of time, the fraction of the uncertainty at any given time point that is made up by these 3 sources of uncertainty. I'll show you like a zoom in the next slide, I think, on just sort of the future portion of this. So this is now cut over here to about 2015. And so what we see now, looking forward, maybe you've already guessed that probably from looking at all these plots before, the largest source of uncertainty towards the end of the century for global temperature is the scenario uncertainty. So which scenario we're going to be on is the most important question. But initially, internal variability is important, and model uncertainty, so how do models respond as well. So that's pretty straightforward.
So Flavio,
Yes.
what's the ensemble part of this? That the initial conditions are varying, or in a single model, or even that?
So so if I'll jump back briefly. Maybe that's helpful. So the ensemble part, if you will, comes in over there with internal variability. But for this is actually, each line is just one simulation per model. We'll get to using the large ensemble in a second. But for something like global temperature, you might not need a large ensemble to sample internal variability, because you can already eyeball that our estimate of internal variability is much smaller relative to the signal. It's important initially, which is kind of what you see over here. So initially we had about 40% of the uncertainty from internal variability, the orange part, but then it reduces quickly to 0. It's a completely different story for other questions, as we'll see in a second. And now with this partitioning, we can also talk a little bit about what we could do about these different sources of uncertainty. I already kind of alluded to the fact that the internal variability part is sort of irreducible. That's just inherent to the system. We might be able to make forecasts over the next couple of years, depending on ENSO and other sort of slower varying aspects of the climate system, but generally it's hard to know what the weather is going to be in 10 to 20 years. Then we have the green part, scenario uncertainty. It's theoretically reducible if we were to know what humans are going to do. And we'll talk a little bit more about this later. But it's a bit more philosophical question almost. But then the blue part is the model uncertainty. That's really actually either our inability, technically or scientifically, to actually know how the climate system is going to respond. That's we all put in our best effort to create these models, and still they don't agree on the answer. That's the blue part, and in a way that's the one that we could reduce as scientists. Not so easy, but could be characterized as reducible. And now we'll sort of get a little bit to your question. So this is again the plot that I showed before, and sort of the separation between forced response and internal variability, how this works reasonably well for something like global temperature. But then I have an example, again, just from one model, for temperature, decadal temperatures over the Southern Ocean, where we see there's large decadal variations sort of superimposed on a warming trend. Right? And so if we then want to do a simple statistical model that should try and tease out what the forced response is it's unclear whether this is a good description of the underlying physical response of the system. It's like just a statistical picture. And so as a consequence, the separation between internal variability and the forced response becomes a little fuzzy. That's kind of where we can like use large ensembles to get a better handle on that. So large ensembles, just a brief highlight slide from a workshop and a paper we had in 2020, where we said like, some of these questions would really benefit from a collection of models that have run large ensembles, because at the time, not that many models had done it. They typically had run 1, 2, 3 simulations per model. And so we collected a lot of them and sort of made them publicly available, which has to date really like helped sort of accelerate some of the science questions that can be answered with them. So here's just a subset of these models. In brackets here we see the ensemble members, so how many times was this model run over this historical and future period. And still one of the largest one is like in this case the MPI with 100 realizations over this time period. Again, only difference between individual simulations are the initial conditions. So it's like a good way to sample the internal variability. And the benefit now is that for each individual model we can estimate its forced response without having to assume a statistical fit. We can average all of these simulations, and sort of by averaging more and more realizations of internal variability, we're reducing the noise and we're starting to approximate the underlying forced response of the model. So getting rid of the noise around what the model actually responds to. Again, for global temperature, that might never be necessary because internal variability relative to the forced response is small, but for regional questions, as we'll see, that matters a little bit more. I think I'm going to jump right to that actually to make this a little easier. Well, actually, no, I probably have to walk through this part. So we're back to like a global, this fractional contribution to total uncertainty for global temperature, as I've shown you before. But the thing that's added here is now this white range. So these are different possible estimates of internal variability from different models. So we can now sort of tease this apart a little bit more. So if we have a model that thinks global temperature variability is small, then like this one here, you don't have to remember the name, we see that it thinks initially the uncertainty just from internal variability is 20%, and then it goes to 0 quickly. And then we have a model like GFDL that has a lot of internal variability that initially thinks over half of the uncertainty is actually attributable to internal variability. And then the average of all of these different models leaves us with this estimate. So the takeaway here is that like now that we have all of these different models and we can do the separation more cleanly, we see that the models don't even necessarily agree precisely on the magnitude of internal variability. For global temperatures, not a huge issue. For some regional questions, it might be more important. So here is decadal changes in Sahel summer precipitation and the uncertainty in those projections into the future. So you see a completely different picture. On the one hand, scenario uncertainty isn't really important in this region. Instead, like the models just generally disagree on the response. So there's a lot of blue in this uncertainty partitioning plot. But then you also see this relatively large range of possible contributions from internal variability. So again, models don't necessarily agree on how large internal variability is. And this is kind of important. I mean, a recent example where we thought quite a bit about this was this big heat wave in the Pacific Northwest, where again the question came up like how much of this is due to or amplified by climate change, and how much is this actually consistent with the natural variability of the system. And if something like this happens that it's way outside of the range of what we've experienced previously, then the question is, of course, do we actually know the true range of the system at hand, even before we change it, but now obviously we're also changing it through CO2 emissions. So again, these models allow us to actually at least quantify how much or how little we know about these questions. And then I have a sort of an extreme local example where just a grid cell near Seattle, looking at winter precipitation projections, where we see throughout the whole century the projection uncertainty is dominated by internal variability. Yes, there's something that we can still figure out about what the climate system is going to do. The model uncertainty is still there, But really, even by the end of the century, this will be dominated by internal variability. So there's not too much we can do about this uncertainty because it's just inherent. Precipitation in Seattle is just very variable relative to the long-term trend. Another thing that you see here is that there's two estimates of how much internal variability contributes. They're not too different. I've sort of sketched it out here. This is assuming internal variability stays actually constant at what it is today or what it's estimated today. And then here it's what it would be, sort of the space it would take up if we allow it to change with warming. And what this comes back to is like work that Angie has done and others have done in recent years and looking at is internal variability itself changing with warming. And for precipitation, this seems to be the case. It goes up almost everywhere. It's to some degree not super surprising. A warmer atmosphere can hold more moisture. Precipitation is a zero-bounded quantity. If we're increasing the mean, we're probably also going to increase the variability. In certain regions, there's more going on than this pure thermodynamic effect. But generally, this is a prime example of how variability itself can change, even absent sort of changes in the mean in certain regions. And again, that's kind of reflected in this breakout of uncertainties. Okay, that's kind of like the basis of that. Then I did want to show you one example that's kind of important for the rest of the talk. Now we've looked at this for, this is the CMIP5, so the 5th generation of these models. And the latest one I said was the 6th one. So it's kind of the same plot, but for the latest generation of models. We have, here we're looking at one more scenario, but generally the story is quite similar. We have a scenario that's kind of roughly getting us to 1.5 or 2 degrees, and then one that's going to go up. But now if we do this partitioning, it looks like we have a much larger model uncertainty in the latest generation of models. The blue area is much larger. And that's primarily because we have a couple of models that warm very much, even that are like quite a bit above sort of the rest of the pack. Now the question is like, is this like truly reflecting our understanding of the climate system? Like, do we know less than we did before? And so what we try to do is come up with what's called an observational or an emergent constraint. So I say, okay, can we like do better than just plotting this up and say like, okay, there's more uncertainty than before. And so what emergent constraints like briefly generally try to do, they try to take a metric that is actually measurable today and relate it to something that will happen in the future. If there is a relationship, we can do the measurements, we can use the measurements of that quantity today to then constrain and say something about which future projection is more likely or not. To make it simpler, a concrete example here is the relationship between global warming over the last couple of decades, past warming, plotted on the x-axis, versus TCR, transient climate response, or in other words, how much a given climate model will warm in the future. And so these individual dots are individual climate model simulations, and you see that there is a relationship. To put it bluntly, models that warm a lot today or over the last couple of decades also tend to warm more in the future. There's some uncertainty around that, which can be quantified, but generally that this is a relationship that seems to exist in the system. And the benefit now is that we can use this gray range here, which is an estimate of how much the globe has actually warmed in observations, to say like, okay, maybe models that fall into this range here are more realistic than models that have warmed quite a bit over the historical period. And given this relationship, we can then also say that models that warm too much today are probably also less trustworthy in terms of their future projections. Lots of caveats to that that I'm not going to talk about today, but what it does allow us to do is then say like, okay, we're going to downweight these models by like a simple distance metric shown down here. But basically, if a model is far from what it should have done over the historical period, the big difference between the model and observations, we're going to give it a lower weight than other models. If we do this for both the CMIP5 and the CMIP6 archive, we end up with this sort of revised or constrained uncertainty partitioning shown in these dotted curves. So for CMIP5, there didn't seem to be a systematic issue there. It's only very little change, but for CMIP6, this blue part comes down quite a bit. So model uncertainty is quite a bit reduced, which, as I sort of already alluded to, there's a couple of very hot models in there, kind of a term that's thrown around. So if we develop this observational constraint, we can sort of rein this in a little bit, and we end up actually with a picture pretty similar to before. Yeah, for the previous generation of model uncertainty. We don't have a lower model uncertainty than before, I'm afraid, but it's also not necessarily significantly larger after developing this constraint. But so in a way, this like brings me to this older paper from Claudio Tipaldi. I'm not sure they were the first to coin the term, but that's where I heard it first. And the models we're working with today, they're like an ensemble of opportunity. They're not by any means like a complete sampling of even our ability of scientists, nor like the real world. And so that's always important to keep in mind when looking at future climate projections. So yeah, to summarize this first part, talked about these three sources of uncertainty. Basically, what will humans do? How will the climate system respond? And which role of the dice, or which like internal variability realization might we see? I try to highlight climate model large ensembles as a useful tool to quantify these differences, also when we talk about regional climate projections, and then also that the relative importance of different uncertainty sources can vary a lot depending on what you look at. Okay. Now I want to try to show you a few things of like sort of ongoing work, which is, yeah, I've already talked to a few people about today. Can we bring these kind of sort of constraints on the physical climate system together with more sort of socioeconomic considerations? And my sort of foray into this work is like often with Fran Moore, collaborator that we put out this paper in 2019, which was a lot of fun, like probably by far the weirdest paper I've been involved in. So what we did is we took geolocated tweets from the US, yeah, roughly 2 billion, which is actually like, I think in the beginning of Twitter, like by default, you had to opt out of your tweets being geolocated. And eventually they changed it, or somebody made them change it to you had to opt in. But so there's a period, a couple of years in the beginning of Twitter where we have really a lot of geolocated tweets, so we know when somebody tweeted in which county in the US he or she was, sorry. Then we combine it with local weather data, and then also a linguistic sentiment algorithm to basically see if people respond to their weather in Twitter, and maybe also does it change over time. And I'm not going to go into all the details, but what we did find is, yes, people react to extreme temperatures, generally weather deviations from normal. That's kind of what we expected to see. But what we also found is that the remarkability, so like how frequent people comment on it, goes down as they're exposed to more and more extreme events. So in a way, we're getting used to it. At least, again, this is just in the US, and also just people who tweet. But at the same time, the language that was used, so the sentiment about those deviations, didn't really change. It remained largely negative. And so we kind of like to, I guess, sell it a little bit to some newspapers. We call it the boiling frog effect, where we have humans, in a way, getting used to a changing climate, but retaining the negative sentiment and not doing anything about it. So the larger implications might be that as climate changes, it doesn't change always as fast or faster than you could adapt to it, at least mentally. And so it's kind of a complicating factor when we think about how to motivate people to think about climate change or do something about it. And so Fran Moore has expanded this, not involved with this paper, to develop a whole model, sort of climate social model, where the study I just showed you featured in, but many others, and made this complicated model that I'm not going to go into details too much, that kind of tries to account for feedbacks between climate and society that have historically, and in all these scenarios I showed you before, not been factored in. So for example, I think that one of the more straightforward ones for me to think through is perception feedback. So this idea that yes, humans get used to some of the climate change, but maybe not to all the way. And so if like climate change becomes severe enough that it affects certain people, the pressure on policymakers to do something about it might increase. That's an assumption. It's based to some extent on social science that exists today, might not hold for future humans. But if that's true, then with more and more severe climate change, there might be more and more pressure on the climate system. So that's a possible feedback, right? And so this model has all kinds of these kind of feedbacks built in and estimated, and it's kind of a new field of science, so we'll see what happens. But what they found is that a lot of these feedbacks are sort of negative in the sense that as the climate gets worse, people are more motivated to do something about it, or at least build pressure to do something about it. A couple of other effects in there. What it does in the end is that it tends to rule out some of the very high emission scenarios as not super plausible. So if we're like looking at, this is for a particular location, Central Europe, temperature projections as they come out of one of the highest emission scenarios that we're currently looking at. This is not just over the next 50 years. And then one of the lowest ones, like one of the ones that's consistent with 1.5 degrees. There are very different assumptions built into these scenarios. This one has like a drastic expansion of coal, and this has a drastic expansion of renewables. And then soon after, 2050, we're starting to have net negative emissions, so we're developing technology at scale to take out CO2 from the atmosphere. So very different futures. And based on the work that I just showed you, as well as others, people think that this scenario is not as likely as it used to be. There's also suggestions that this scenario is not as likely, so the best case and worst case. And so if you take into account the work I just showed, or try to take it into account quantitatively, we're actually coming up with a reduction of, in this case, temperature projections over Europe from the upper end down, as well as from the lower end up. So if we summarize this for just for the decade centered on 2050, we basically end up with a range of temperature that we start out with that is wide. So on the right y-axis is expressed relative to pre-industrial conditions, so anywhere from 2 to 5 degrees. And then we have these two constraints, the one I just talked about, sort of scenario uncertainty constraint. We think these high emission scenarios are not quite as likely, but we also think that the most optimistic ones are not as likely. So let's weigh this and rein in sort of this range a little bit. And then this third bar is a constraint on the response uncertainty. So this is what I talked about before. Models that warm too much today, warm too much in the future. If we account for stuff like that, we can also bring down the response uncertainty a little bit. And if we combine these two constraints, sort of socioeconomic or climate social constraints, and sort of physical climate system constraints, we end up with quite a bit reduced uncertainty in future projections. There's lots of caveats to that, and the reviewers were sure to tell me, so we'll see what actually happens with that. But I think that's like something that we can start to try to do, because it's an interesting area where we bring together like more soft science, socioeconomic science, with some of the constraints that are based on physical climate modeling and observations of the climate system. Okay. Now I gotta double check again the time, like how long. We started about 3:05. We should end up by 4. Okay, so we have a bit of time to talk about another example here. Because I kind of promised that we try to bring it down to more local scale, so I did want to talk a little bit more about what this might mean once we get to the ground. And so I've done quite a bit of work on the hydroclimate, precipitation, soil moisture, etc. In the western US. It started when I was at NCAR in Colorado. And I usually like to start out with this map of some of the biggest rivers in the United States. And one that gets kind of the most headline is like this, actually not that big river, the Colorado River here in the west. It's kind of a joke compared to the Mississippi, of course, but because it flows through arid regions, it's really important. It has seen a lot of research. It has the 2 biggest reservoirs in the United States, somewhere in the middle between the upper and the lower basin. It's Lake Mead and Lake Powell, that are really important to sort of like allow a lot of sustainable economic development in the West based on agriculture and municipal use. Problem is a little bit that the storage has been going down. So this is a paper from Brad Udall, where you should see the combined storage of water in these 2 reservoirs that peaked in the 1980s and has been in like steep decline since then. That's for a combination of reasons. On the one hand, there was a bit of an increase in the actual demand, so population increased, agriculture increased. But we also had declining inflows due to decrease in precipitation and a particular increase in temperature leading to more evaporative loss primarily. And so there's kind of a real crisis out there in terms of how to manage this sustainably going forward. And when you want to do that, and they actually have to, by 2026 they have to come up with a new agreement between all the states that have access to the water from the Colorado River, so like California, Nevada, Colorado, Arizona, etc. They have to kind of divvy up by 2026, come up with new rules how to manage this reservoir, who gets how much water basically. And for that they want to know what to expect in the future. And so when it comes to temperature, we know that it's going to get warmer, so we have, again, I kind of make the case that we don't know exactly how much, but like compared to some of the other quantities that are relevant, we have a good handle on temperature. So you see here sort of mid-century temperature projections over this region. But then when it comes to precipitation, this is what it looks like, and we see these two types of hatching and stippling. So we have this stippling where we have what we call no signal emergence. So the change that's projected by the climate models is actually smaller than internal variability. So it's kind of hard to tease out. But then also we have this smaller region with the hatching where the models don't actually agree on the change or the sign of the change in the precipitation. And in this case, this cuts right through our watershed that we're interested in. So in other words, we don't actually know exactly how much precipitation we should expect. And then finally, if we look at runoff projections, so how much actually, how much water will be sort of available at the surface or near surface, we see that it's even a larger area where there's no agreement on the sign. So we have in a way a cascading expansion of uncertainty as we go to like deeper into these variables of the hydrologic cycle. And so then we come up to another topic that I just want to mention briefly, but I was told Dave Lawrence had already mentioned this when he was here last week or a few weeks ago. This like expansion of uncertainty, we don't actually always know exactly where it's coming from. So why are uncertainties in runoff larger than uncertainties in precipitation projections? And one thing that we're looking at in the project right now is what's called runoff sensitivity and how well that's presented or represented in climate models. And so what runoff sensitivity is, simply, it's basically how much should we expect runoff to change in a given basin like the Colorado Basin for a given amount of warming or a given change in precipitation. So like, yeah, how sensitive is the system to climate change really? But asking it at the watershed scale. And so there's two things, two sensitivities wrapped up into this sensitivity. So to say one is like the precipitation sensitivity. I just mentioned how does runoff change for a given percentage change in precipitation, and how much does runoff change for given degree of warming. And so we can estimate this again from observations. This is now for the Upper Colorado. These two quantities are given in red. And then we have a series of climate models, their sensitivity plotted on top of that. There's a lot of uncertainty there because it's kind of a noisy metric. We don't have perfect observations, but we can say that some models are outside of what we think the sensitivity should be. So those models do not react the way we think they should react to changes in temperature and precipitation. So we have a project that just started to try to look to, does this apply to other basins outside of the Western US? And where does it come from? Why do certain models have the wrong sensitivity to improve that part of the projections? Okay. And then finally, I think maybe that's probably the last part I'll say. I have a bit too many slides. But it's basically bringing this home to why people are asking for climate change projections, and why I think we have some work to do to provide that information. And so this is a plot from a paper that Justin Mankin led a few years ago, where we're looking at changes in 10-year average rainfall over the Western US, so kind of a similar region as what we just looked at. But they're all centered on a best estimate. So these two PDFs are really just sampling the internal variability around the best estimate future projection. So we've gotten rid of the response uncertainty that we talked about, just for a thought experiment. So what we're looking at in blue are the plausible range of precipitation projections from 40 different climate models from CMIP 5, and this would look pretty similar from CMIP 6. And then in red, we have a much larger ensemble, but just from 7 models. So these are like 7 large ensembles that I talked about before, each of them having several simulations. So they do a much better job of sampling internal variability. But in terms of model space, it's fewer, it's just 7 instead of 40. So when we see this, that like with this larger sampling of internal variability, we actually do come up with a wider PDF. And then this is sort of like stylized maps to different potential outcomes that one might derive from these projections. Remember, these are like 10-year average precipitation projections. And this could range from, like thinking about new infrastructure to having to come up with, to prevent flooding, to having to come up with new supplies. And so like a lot of the work that's being done right now or has historically on projections of hydrology in the Western US and elsewhere, at best, it is based on a selection of CMIP 5 models, never really 4D, because like what people usually do is they take these models and downscale them, run them through hydrology models, so that's costly in itself. So typically, people aren't doing all 40 models. Yet even this is like kind of undersampling the possible outcomes that you can get just from internal variability, even if you choose fewer models, but more realizations of each model. And again, this is where I sort of map these real-world examples to. This is labeled as California drought, but really if we're looking at Lake Mead in 2021 as well as in 2014, extremely low. And then it was really only a couple of decades before in 1983 where it's basically overtopping. So this large internal variability that's superimposed on any future change. For questions like this, it's really important to sample this properly, which I don't think we've been doing so far. Okay, I think I'm going to stop here. I'm super happy to talk more about this. I have a bunch of additional slides later, but I'll stop here. I'll summarize, I think, some of the main points that I want to take home, and which I feel are also opportunities to collaborate. Climate change adaptation happens at regional scales, but unfortunately projection uncertainty is large. We're working on developing constraints, or another way you could like try to sample like this vast space in like somewhat informed ways. Like you can think of what's the worst case scenario for my particular system, like a reservoir like we just looked at. Tell me about that. In all of these, I found these climate model large ensembles to be very useful tools. It takes usually a little while to explain to stakeholders what internal variability is. I hope I did a good enough job to explain it to you. But that's why I think, working with this tool forward is quite useful. It's like mostly being kind of restricted to academic research, but given some of the results we're seeing, I think it's important to carry that into adaptation science more generally. Okay, I'll leave it at that. I just wanted to say, if you're interested in these models, there's a bunch, of course, on the CMIP 6 archive, but we also have the multimodal large ensemble archive, where a lot of these broad simulations are available. Thank you. Yeah.
Can you go back to your precipitation and runoff plots, those figures? Yeah, so these ones are just showing for all the CMIP 5 multi-models, right?
Yep.
So my question is, since you're looking at like a regional area, do you think that like the course resolution could be a reason why the internal variability is larger than the actual changes we're seeing? Like if we were to use like the high res MIP models that are supposed to be coming out, right? Like do you think this analysis would improve, I guess, is my question? Or do you think it's just model uncertainty?
So you're, if I understand correctly, you're asking that whether if we go to higher resolution, would all the models converge on an answer?
Like, would we see like more of a change in the precipitation or in the runoff? Because you're getting a lot where the internal variability is just larger, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I guess because it's regional, my question is it also an issue of resolution?
I think it's not primarily an issue of resolution. It's certainly the case that these models are coarse, and we're looking in this case at regions that involve mountains, which are thus poorly resolved in climate models. However, what you end up having when you have a regional climate model that has a high resolution, it still has to be driven by a global climate model, because by definition it's just a region.
Right.
So at its boundaries it's driven by a global climate model. So if some of these precipitation changes are driven by changes in the jet stream, large-scale circulation, that would also be imprinted on your regional model. And that's what we see if we look at regional climate models. They give you a high-resolution version of the same answer. There's some cases where the sign does change, but what I have not seen yet, I'm happy to learn about it, is a lot of high-resolution models actually converging on the answer, so that the model uncertainty actually goes away with higher resolution. I have not seen that yet.
So you think like the new high-res MIP ensemble won't necessarily improve this? That's more like
It will give us a high resolution answer that is still going to be uncertain. Yeah. Putting it a little bit provocative, I'm all in favor of doing it for the sake of getting the answer to your question.
Okay.
I'm not super hopeful.
Hi. I was wondering if you can go back to the slide where you kind of meshed the social constraints in, because I thought that was really interesting.
Like this one or the...
Yeah.
Mhm.
So great talk, and it was fascinating to see like this attempt to like kind of constrain the scenarios. I have two questions about this. One, I'm curious if you have any thoughts on, you know, if this were to become like, you know, I guess more supported, this kind of methodology. What's the best way to like communicate this to like policymakers? And that kind of feeds my second question, which is maybe I'm thinking about it a little too hard, but if you're, for example, communicating that there's no chance of reaching like a 2.5, you know, Celsius goal, does that also like change some of the assumptions in the social constraints when you communicate?
Oh yeah, that's a good question. So the first one, what I would say, and this is probably not greatly conveyed here, is that we're trying to talk about like a range that has a certain probability, right? So I think probably nobody is capable of ruling out the worst case scenario, right? In theory, all the world governments could decide tomorrow, let's go all in on coal, even though it's economically not feasible. Humans do irrational things, so we can literally probably not exclude that, but we would probably try to say it's outside the 5 to 95% probability. So I think it's important to have that conversation, because it's a little bit like thinking about, from an engineering perspective, return levels. You build a dam, and it has to be able to protect you from like a 1 in 100 year flood or something. But what if a 1 in 1,000 year flood comes, right? So these are like conversations that you would have when you build the dam, hopefully. And it's the same conversation we would have to have if we provide constrained projections. We would need to tell them, I'm sorry, I cannot exclude your worst case scenario. We think it's less likely than we said last week. That's what we're telling you. If your system is extremely vulnerable to this worst case, right? If this is going to really tank whatever you're doing, you probably want to keep looking at papers that, you know, focus on this scenario. So that's probably an important discussion. The other one is I'm not sure I have the answer to. There is, I think that's not in that model yet. Yeah, this idea that like somebody comes along and does say, forget about the 2-degree target. What does that do to society? It's super important, I think, because I'm not quite sure what's going to happen when we're blowing through the 1.5 degree target in 10 years or so, because a lot of the news media is like kind of like the world's going to end, but like you all know, gradual climate change is kind of gradual. Nothing extreme will happen at 1.5 degrees. If it does, it's because of internal variability and purely by chance. But like the general public, I'm not quite sure how they're going to take it when we say like, yeah, we went above 1.5 degrees and the world is still there. They're like, well, but you told us that it's going to end. So it's, yeah, good question. I'll forward it to Fran Moore. No, I also want to think about it. Yep.
First of all, thank you so much for a great talk, and also for the effort you put into the multimodal large ensemble archive, which has been super useful to lots of people. And the large ensemble approach has been super useful in so many ways, but the one surprising way to me, which is actually, I don't think was the intent, and I think has some bearing on what you're showing here, is that if you look at the forced response across all the models and all the large ensembles available, that the forced response looks a lot more like the real world than A, I would have ever expected, and B, than it does like any of the individual. And that's not just true in global mean temperature, but it's also true in modes of variability, PDO and NAO and North African rainfall and vertical wind shear of the North Atlantic.
Mm-hmm.
All these things look so much more like the forced response, which is what we learned from large ensembles. But then it also implies that the noise in the system is too large.
Yep.
And so when you say things like, this could happen, this one ensemble member, and it might look the opposite to what the forced response is, that actually maybe it couldn't.
Mm-hmm.
So I just wondering, given that, because you're nodding, which means it looks like you're not disagreeing, which I think there are people that would, but given that, how does it change the way you present this?
Well, I think you're talking about the signal to noise paradox, and I'm only just sort of catching up on the literature. I know NAO and your stuff with the PDO. I don't know how widely it applies. I think it's fascinating. Yeah, it would change a lot of these quantifications. Yeah, I'm not sure I completely follow yet how it might rule out a certain range of individual realizations, right? It could just be that the forced response is larger relative to the noise, but that the noise is still as large as portrayed by these models. But maybe I have to think through it more.
Yeah, I think we all do.
It is, yeah. But I think that has pretty wide implications. I didn't know so there's other examples. North Africa, you
Well, we
mentioned.
have I don't know if Chen Pei's here online, but has a paper
Mhm.
that's in review in Nature on that now, which I'm happy to share. Hopefully
Cool.
it'll get published.
Yeah, no, I'd love to talk more about it. Yeah, no, it's I think one of the biggest recognitions or things that we've learned over the last couple of years on this.
From the large ensembles.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I wanted to follow up on Dora's question that your skepticism that high-res myth would lead to better understanding, like what you were showing with the runoff,
Mm-hmm.
being so variable across models and you're not sure why. Like,
Mm-hmm.
I would think just being able to resolve the mountains and the rain catchment areas would help with that. I'm just wondering why.
Well, I guess the question, maybe I sounded too skeptical. Maybe the question is to define what help means. It would would lead to a better process representation, right? And maybe a better understanding of what's going on in the individual models. But will it automatically mean that all the models converge on an answer, right? That the response uncertainty will decrease. That I'm not sure it will happen just by changing the resolution. It could. I mean, maybe the best, in a way, the easiest way I have to think through an example is like convection, there it might help because we can start to turn off a lot of parametrizations that we know are somewhat limited. So we might expect all the models to start to respond similarly to it. But I just know from, I guess, stuff that Angie told me, that for extreme precipitation, where this is one of the hopes, right? Like, how does extreme precipitation change in the future when we go to higher resolution? It's not that the models suddenly all agree on the same answer. There's like a similar spread in the answer to the question, how does extreme precipitation change in the high-res MIP? But in a way, this is also just sort of the beginning of that. Right? And the high-res MIP doesn't switch off parametrizations for convection. I think it's like 25 kilometers or so.
I just wanted to build off that now. So at the beginning, you talked about like the 3 different colors, the internal variability. Like you said that the model uncertainty is the one that we're most easily able to reduce. Do you have like any sort of ideas in mind on how we can reduce model uncertainty across like the CMIP ensemble going forward? Because like you said, like depending on which model you use, you're going to get a different answer, right? And that changes like regionally. So do you have any thoughts on that?
I have lots of thoughts. I'm not sure any is like satisfying your constraint like broadly across CMIP 5 because like these models are developed individually, right, by many people. Of course, we hopefully learn collectively. One thing that this project with the runoff sensitivity is part of is a bigger effort to develop diagnostic, like process-oriented diagnostic packages where like people come up with metrics like the runoff sensitivity and try to understand why it's wrong and develop a package that can be then applied to all climate models so that like hopefully the lessons learned from like an individual modeling centers can be tested in other models and see if this is a consistent bias across all the models and maybe even a consistent cause because we do share code. So that's kind of the best effort that's underway to develop these packages that then look at it systematically. But broadly speaking, yeah, sometimes 2 hot models might be hot for different reasons. And so I couldn't give you a general recipe to do that. That'd be great. Is there another question? Nope.
Any more questions? Anything online?
Yeah, and as mentioned, I'm here through Friday, so happy to chat about any other things as well.
Yeah, so a little housekeeping notes to close us out here. The Cornell double feature continues on Friday at 11 a.m. With Dr. Angeline Pendergrass. And I believe Paquita sent out a Google Doc if anyone's interested in signing up to meet with Flavio or Angie over the next couple of days. That should be in everyone's inbox. And so yeah, thank you. Thanks everyone for coming.
Thank you.